Robert Redford spent 89 years on this earth, and for most of them he carried something the cameras never fully caught. A grief so old it had become part of his posture, part of the way he looked slightly past you even when he was looking directly at you. He died on September 16, 2025, at his mountain home in Sundance, Utah, passing in his sleep in the place he had built, not as a retreat from the world, but as an argument about what the world could look like if you let honest storytelling run the show. The news spread quietly at first, then all at once, and the film world fell into the particular kind of silence that follows the loss of someone who had been defining the shape of things for so long that their presence had started to feel permanent. He was not just an actor. That framing undersells what he actually did. Over more than 6 decades, Redford worked as an actor, a director, a producer, and the founder of a cultural institution that permanently altered the architecture of American independent cinema. He did all of this while losing 2 sons, surviving a marriage that lasted 27 years before the pressures of a Hollywood career finally wore it down, and carrying childhood losses that most people never fully recover from. The public version of Robert Redford, the Blue Eyes, the Sundance Kid, the man who built the festival, was real, but the private version, the one shaped by grief and discipline and a stubborn refusal to let suffering be wasted, was what gave the public version its weight. Before any of that, before the Academy Award for Best Director and the iconic pairing with Paul Newman, Robert Charles Redford Jr. was born on August 18, 1936 in Santa Monica, California, into a working-class household where money was steady but never abundant. His father, Charles Redford, kept accounts at Standard Oil. His mother, Martha Hart, kept the family's faith in its own future alive, and she directed most of that faith toward her son. She told him regularly that he was meant for something larger than what surrounded him, and she said it with enough conviction that he carried the belief forward even after she was gone. Childhood handed him losses with an almost deliberate cruelty. When Robert was 8 years old, his uncle was killed in the Battle of the Bulge. Not a distant relative, but someone who felt like the template for what a man could become, an athlete who spoke 4 languages and moved through the world with a confidence young Robert studied closely. That death was his first real education in impermanence. 3 years later, at 11, he woke one morning to find his body had stopped responding, his limbs paralyzed, and doctors confirmed polio. 2 weeks immobilized in a body that had always been his most reliable instrument left a permanent imprint. An awareness that life runs on no guarantees and can be interrupted without warning at all. And then at 18, Martha Hart died at only 40 years old from complications during pregnancy. The woman who believed in him before he gave her a single reason to was suddenly gone, and for years afterward he was learning, without quite knowing it, how to carry grief without letting it stop him entirely. High school gave him baseball, and little else worth keeping. A scholarship got him into the University of Colorado, where recklessness and drinking took over, and a near-fatal car crash made it clear he was accelerating toward destruction rather than any kind of future. Losing that scholarship turned out to be a different kind of luck. He left America, wandered through Italy, studied painting in Florence, survived on illustration work, and moved through Paris on nearly nothing. Poverty gave him a freedom that money never had, and in that period of genuine uncertainty, he found something close to a center, a sense of what he actually cared about when nobody was watching. Back in New York, the American Academy of Dramatic Arts gave him a framework for turning everything he'd absorbed into usable craft. Broadway arrived first, and the 1963 Neil Simon production of Barefoot in the Park made his name in a way that smaller work never had. Robert Redford as Paul Bratter, charming and sincere and entirely believable, packing the theater every night. Hollywood followed naturally, and by 1969, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid placed him opposite Paul Newman in a pairing so effortless it looked unplanned, and the Sundance Kid became the name he'd carry for the rest of his life. Not just on screen, but on the land in Utah, he'd eventually transform into something entirely his own. The 70s defined what kind of artist he was going to be. Jeremiah Johnson in 1972, The Candidate that same year, The Way We Were with Barbra Streisand in 1973, and The Sting, also 1973, which earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor and showed audiences that beneath the looks, there was genuine precision at work. All the President's Men in 1976, with Dustin Hoffman as his partner, dramatized the Watergate scandal with a restraint that made it more disturbing rather than less, and Redford became in that film something beyond a movie star. He became a voice for a generation that had watched American institutions fail publicly and was still working out what to believe instead. Directing arrived with Ordinary People in 1980, and his debut feature won him the Academy Award for Best Director. The film dissected the silence inside a grieving American family, the way unspoken pain accumulates until it deforms everything around it, and critics who expected competence found something closer to a diagnosis. A River Runs Through It followed in 1992 and used a Montana river as a metaphor for lives lived in parallel without ever fully connecting. Quiz Show in 1994 examined the corrupted machinery behind American television. Each of these films shared the same instinct: restraint over spectacle, the single-held expression over the speech that explains what the character is feeling. And that aesthetic came from a genuine place in Redford, from decades of learning that the most important things very rarely get said out loud. The Sundance Institute, founded in 1981, grew from a training center into the most significant independent film festival in American cinema. It became the launchpad for Quentin Tarantino, Steven Soderbergh, Darren Aronofsky, Chloe Zhao, and scores of filmmakers whose stories the major studios would never have funded. Redford understood that the films Hollywood declined to make were often exactly the films that most needed making, and he built an institution capable of making them anyway. That decision alone reshaped American film culture in directions still playing out today, and it represents arguably the most enduring part of his legacy. Away from the screen, a private life carried its own sustained weight. In 1958, he eloped with Lola Van Wagenen, a young woman from Provo, Utah, raised in a traditional Mormon household, whose steadiness balanced everything volatile in him. Her family opposed the marriage. The ceremony had no money and no glamour to speak of. Only two people who believed what they were building together would eventually justify whatever it cost them to start. For nearly 3 decades, Lola was the architecture of the family, raising their children through Redford's long absences, holding daily life together while he chased the career, and managing with grace the specific loneliness that comes with being married to someone the entire world finds compelling. Their first child, Scott, arrived in 1959. 3 months later, sudden infant death syndrome took him, and the loss sat in both parents differently. Lola told Robert they couldn't change what had happened, but could choose what came next. And it was her steadiness in that devastated moment, not his strength but hers, that gave him a way forward. 3 more children followed: Shauna in 1960, James in 1962, and Amy in 1970. Shauna became a painter who built a quiet life deliberately distant from Hollywood. Amy became a director and actress whose work at the Sundance Film Festival earned recognition entirely independent of her father's reputation. James became the son who most visibly carried his father's spirit, a filmmaker, an environmental activist, a man who survived 2 liver transplants in the 1990s for a rare liver disease and turned that ordeal into the foundation of advocacy work around organ donation. Robert stood beside James through those hospital years with the helpless terror of a parent who can witness suffering but cannot stop it. James recovered, directed documentaries, raised a family, and kept working until complications from his earlier illness developed into liver cancer that gave him no second chance. He died on October 16, 2020, at 58 years old, surrounded by his family in the days before the end. Redford wrote to friends afterward that James was not just his son, but someone he genuinely admired, that the grief was beyond the reach of any words he had. He had now lost both sons, Scott at 3 months old, James at 58, and between those 2 losses lay every milestone a parent lives to witness and dreads to miss. The marriage to Lola ended in 1985, after 27 years. The distance the career demanded had built up slowly into something the relationship could no longer hold. The split carried no hostility, both of them said so, and their continued co-parenting bore that out. But it was real, and Redford acknowledged openly that he had let work take priority in ways that cost his family. Lola went on to earn a PhD in history from New York University and build her own career in social activism, co-founding Consumer Action Now and working on environmental protection and gender equality for years after the marriage ended. Redford called her the true love of his life in more than one interview, and the weight behind those words was not nostalgia. It was recognition arriving too late to change anything. Brief relationships followed, with Brazilian actress Sonia Braga in 1987, Swedish actress Lena Olin in 1990, and costume designer Kathy O'Rear during that same period. None of them lasted, and each one closed quietly. That changed when he met Sibylle Sagars, a German environmental artist, at the Sundance Resort. She came to exhibit her work, encountered him as an ordinary person rather than an icon, and that simplicity turned out to be exactly what he'd been missing. After more than a decade together, they married in 2009 in Hamburg, Germany, in a ceremony with no celebrity guests and no press presence. Only the people they actually loved. Sibylle became his collaborator on The Way of the Rain, a project joining art and environmental advocacy, with her handling creative direction and Redford contributing the storytelling instincts he'd spent 60 years developing. Climate change was the subject, but the real work was persuasion, convincing people that something invisible could still be urgent. His final screen appearance came in The Old Man and the Gun in 2018, a film that played like a deliberate farewell. The Sundance Kid grown into an elder statesman, still moving through the world on his own terms, still impossible to fully contain. After that, he stepped back. The painting he'd loved since his European years in the 1950s took more of his time. The environmental work continued. Life at Sundance, and sometimes in Santa Fe, New Mexico, organized itself around shared values rather than public performance, and for the first time in decades, the pace of his life matched the quieter instincts he'd always had, but rarely been able to act on. Robert Redford died on September 16, 2025, and what remains is not simply a filmography or a festival or a shelf of awards. What remains is the evidence that grief, if you're willing to work with it rather than around it, can become the material of something lasting. He built Sundance from a belief that the stories institutions ignore are usually the ones most worth telling. He directed films about silence and family and the specific American habit of pretending everything is fine when nothing is. He performed in ways that looked effortless because the effort was buried under 60 years of understanding exactly what the camera sees when you stop performing for it. The silence following his passing is not the absence of something. It's what a full life sounds like when it finally comes to rest.